You learned how to love before you were old enough to know you were learning. Not from conversations, not from watching other people, from the specific texture of what happened in your body during the first year of your life, when you reached for someone, and whether they came. Whether they came consistently, whether coming meant safety, whether their face, when it appeared, was the thing that made the world make sense again. Take a slow breath. We have time. What I want to explore with you tonight goes deeper than personality types and compatibility quizzes. It goes down to the architecture of how your nervous system was built to attach, and why the love you reach for now so often feels like it's following a pattern you didn't write. There's a finding I want to hold for the second half, something that came out of an interview study in 1985 that genuinely shocked the researchers involved. It reframes the entire question of whether any of this can change. And there's also something about how your brain processes the people you get close to. Something discovered almost by accident, watching infants for 3 minutes at a time, that will completely change the way you understand what it means when someone calls themselves, or someone they love, emotionally unavailable. You did not choose your template, but you are carrying it. And understanding what it is, where it came from, and what it is actually doing is not a small thing. For most of the 20th century, the dominant theory of why children bond with their caregivers was something called the cupboard love hypothesis. The name tells you most of what you need to know. The idea, drawn from Freudian drive theory and widely embraced by behaviorists of the era, was that infants attached to whoever fed them. Love, in this model, was a side effect of hunger. The emotional bond was learned through association. The caregiver was associated with food. Food reduced distress. Therefore, the caregiver reduced distress. Simple, mechanical, neatly testable. Warmth was secondary. Presence was incidental. Physical comfort was, in some prominent theories, actually a risk. Too much soothing, and you would condition dependence. The recommended approach, in many parenting guides of the mid-century, was measured restraint. Don't pick them up too quickly. Don't reinforce the crying. Teach them to regulate alone. This was not a fringe view. It shaped hospital policy. Children undergoing surgery were separated from their parents for days at a time, because the distress was assumed to be about the unfamiliar environment, not about the loss of the person. It shaped orphanage practice. It shaped what generations of parents were told, by doctors and psychologists and well-meaning relatives, about what love required, and what indulgence risked. What it could not explain was what James Robertson was documenting on film. Robertson was a social worker at the Tavistock Institute in London in the late 1940s. He began filming children who had been separated from their parents, for hospital stays, for institutional placements, and the footage did not look like conditioned behavior adjusting to new circumstances. It looked like grief. A 2-year-old named Laura, filmed across 9 days in a hospital without her parents, moved through stages Robertson described as protest, then despair, then a withdrawal so profound that when her mother finally arrived, Laura turned her face away. Not because she had been fed, not because of reinforcement, because something fundamental had been broken, and the body knew it before the theory did. To understand where this goes next, it helps to know why it mattered so personally. Because this is not just the history of an academic debate. This is the story of how the map of your interior life got drawn, and by whom. John Bowlby was a British psychiatrist and psychoanalyst working at the same institute as Robertson. He watched the films, and he had been reading ethology, the study of animal behavior in natural environments. A colleague had put a translation of Konrad Lorenz's 1935 paper on imprinting into his hands, and something clicked into place. Lorenz had shown that goslings imprinted on the first moving figure they encountered after hatching, not because of food, not because of reward, but because proximity itself was the survival mechanism. Staying near a known figure was the behavior that kept you alive when you were small and vulnerable. Bond formation wasn't conditioned, it was designed. Bowlby proposed that human infants had the same evolutionary architecture, not learned association with a food source. A biologically driven system designed to monitor one fundamental question: is my caregiver nearby, accessible, and responsive? When the answer was yes, the attachment system settled. The infant could explore, could engage with the world from a position Bowlby called the secure base. When the answer was no, protest, then despair. Then, if the absence extended long enough, a kind of terrible detachment, the switching off of the seeking itself. He published his theory across 3 volumes between 1969 and 1982. The psychoanalytic establishment, for the most part, rejected him. He was drawing on animal studies. He had abandoned drive theory. He was, to many of his contemporaries, building a theory that belonged in a different field. But one person was listening carefully, and she had a way to test it. Here's what the test found, and why it should, even now, stop you mid-breath. Mary Ainsworth was a developmental psychologist who had spent time in Uganda in the late 1950s, observing mothers and infants in their natural homes, watching the actual texture of how they moved through their days, how the child reached, and how the mother responded, how much exploring the infant did, and how close they stayed to the familiar body. When she returned to the United States and set up a laboratory at Johns Hopkins, she designed a procedure that would become one of the most cited studies in all of developmental psychology. She called it the strange situation. 12-month-old infants came into an unfamiliar room with their caregiver. A stranger entered. The caregiver left. The caregiver returned. The whole sequence lasted roughly 20 minutes. And Ainsworth watched what the infants did. What she found, across hundreds of children, was not random variation. The responses fell into 3 unmistakably distinct patterns. About 60 to 70% of the infants were what she labeled secure. When the caregiver left, they showed real distress. When the caregiver returned, they went to them, accepted comfort, and settled. Back to exploring. The separation had been hard. The reunion repaired it. The internal question, is the caregiver available, had been reliably answered yes, and the body had organized itself. Accordingly, a second group, roughly 20 to 25%, appeared almost indifferent. No visible distress at separation. No real greeting at reunion. They continued with the toys. They treated the stranger and the parent with near identical affect. Ainsworth labeled these children anxious avoidant. The third group, about 10 to 15%, showed something more complicated. They were extremely distressed when the caregiver left, but could not be comforted when the caregiver returned. They reached up to be held, then pushed away. They cried and resisted simultaneously. Anxious ambivalent or anxious resistant. 3 patterns. 3 histories of caregiving, measured in a laboratory at 12 months old. Here is what should make you pause. Those 3-minute observations predicted how those same children approached close friendships at age 6, romantic relationships in adolescence, and intimate partnerships as adults, documented across decades of follow-up work by L. Alan Schroof and his colleagues at the University of Minnesota, who followed a cohort of children from infancy into their 30s. 3 minutes. 3 decades. Not because the pattern is a sentence, but because the strategy you developed to get as much safety as possible from the specific caregiver you had, that strategy became your operating system. Your body learned it before your mind could name it, and your body kept using it, long past the environment that required it. There is a finding I want to come back to about what happens when those learned strategies enter your adult relationships, particularly the one about avoidant attachment, which the research describes in a way that will reframe almost everything the culture says about emotional unavailability. But first, the deeper layer of how this works. Bowlby called it the internal working model. It is not a conscious belief system. It is closer to embedded code, a set of predictions about other people and about yourself in relation to them, written in experience before language, updated by every significant relationship since. The model has two components. One is a model of other people. Are they available? Responsive? Safe when I'm struggling? The other is a model of yourself. Am I worthy of their care? Will my needs be seen? Am I the kind of person who gets to ask? If your earliest experiences reliably answered yes to both, through a caregiver who came when you cried, who soothed when you were distressed, who was present and consistent, even without being perfect, your working model is organized around safety. You can tolerate temporary unavailability without interpreting it as abandonment. You can express needs without bracing for punishment. You can be angry at someone and still trust the relationship will survive it. If those answers were unreliable, or conditional, or absent, your system found a different strategy, not a wrong one. The most adaptive, one available to it at the time. In 1987, researchers Cindy Hazan and Philip Shaver proposed something that sounds obvious in retrospect, but was genuinely contested at the time. Adult romantic love is an attachment relationship. The same system that organized behavior in Ainsworth's Strange Situation was organizing how adults fell in love, behaved in conflict, and responded to loss. Their work found that adult descriptions of romantic relationships mapped almost exactly onto the infant categories. Secure adults described love as trusting, stable, comfortable, with both closeness and independence. Anxious adults described love as intense, consuming, threaded through with fear of loss. Avoidant adults described it as uncomfortable with too much closeness, a subtle pulling back just when things got deep. The infant categories had grown up. What they had grown into is worth examining closely, because the culture understands them, in almost every case, precisely backwards. If anxious attachment is your pattern, here is what is happening in your nervous system, because the story told about people like you is almost entirely wrong. The story says you are too much, clingy, difficult, that your responses are disproportionate, that you manufacture crises, that you need reassurance in a way that strains relationships. The language almost always frames it as excess. Too much feeling, too much need, too much of everything. But the research shows that your responses are proportionate to the situation your nervous system believes it is in. Philip Shaver, Mario Mikulincer, and their colleagues have spent decades documenting what they call the hyperactivating strategy. The attachment system in anxiously attached individuals runs at elevated sensitivity. It amplifies distress signals rather than dampening them. It monitors the environment constantly for any sign of impending unavailability. A delayed reply is not just inconvenient, it is data. Ambiguous expressions are not ambiguous. They are potential withdrawal. Silence is not rest. Silence is the early stages of abandonment. Research measuring cortisol, the primary stress hormone, shows that anxiously attached adults produce measurably elevated cortisol in response to relationship ambiguity, even when no actual threat is present. Your body is doing what it was calibrated to do. It learned, in a caregiving environment where availability was inconsistent, that the cost of missing the signal of impending unavailability was catastrophic. So it set its sensitivity threshold lower, so it would never miss it again. You are not too much. Your alarm system was built for a different environment than the one you are actually in. And here is what that creates in adult love. You seek reassurance because the reassurance genuinely settles something biological, for a moment. But the settling doesn't hold, because the alarm resets. So you seek more. And if a partner, worn, down, creates distance in response, the alarm escalates. The behavior designed to restore the bond begins paradoxically to erode it. And that erosion feels like confirmation. Evidence, proof that the fear was accurate all along. The loop feeds itself. Not because you are broken, because you are adaptive in a way that no longer quite fits the life you are actually trying to live. There is something the research found about avoidant attachment that the culture has never properly reckoned with. And here is where we need to slow down, because what I'm about to tell you may shift something. The cultural story says people with avoidant attachment are cold, that they don't really feel things deeply, that they are fundamentally less emotional, less needing, less available to love than the rest of us. It frames avoidance as personality, as a kind of inherent chill that some people simply have. Here is what the research actually documented. In work from the late 1980s into early 1990s, researchers including Kobach and Skiri monitored avoidantly attached adolescents during attachment activating procedures, tasks designed to activate the attachment system by prompting recall of early separation and closeness. They measured both self-reported distress and physiological markers of arousal, heart rate, skin conductance. The avoidant individuals appeared calm, minimal visible distress, minimal reported upset, exactly as the stereotype would predict. But their physiological readings told a completely different story. Heart rate and skin conductance were just as elevated as in anxiously attached individuals, in some cases higher. The emotional storm was happening. They had simply learned to suppress the outward signal so completely that neither observers nor the participants themselves fully registered it. Not cold, flooding in silence. Mario Mikulincer and Philip Shaver described this as the deactivating strategy, where anxious attachment turns the Sogmunstets, volume up on distress. Avoidant attachment turns it off at the output, while the internal signal keeps running. Why? Because the caregiving history these individuals encountered was one of consistent emotional unresponsiveness. Not necessarily dramatic neglect, not necessarily cruelty, but a caregiver who pulled back when emotion was expressed, who was more comfortable with independence than need, who, perhaps without any conscious intention at all, rewarded self-containment and withdrew subtly, repeatedly, when the child reached for closeness. And so the child learned. Reach less, show less, need less, or at least appear to. Because conditional proximity, staying near enough to be protected, quiet enough not to be rejected, was better than no proximity at all. That lesson was not a failure of emotional development. It was a masterpiece of adaptation to the specific caregiver available. What this creates in adult love is a person who genuinely values connection, but whose entire learned system is organized around managing the distance, because closeness triggers the old threat. They may choose partners who are emotionally intense and then feel overwhelmed and pull back. They may feel the relationship most acutely at the moment it ends, when the distance is finally safe enough to miss what was lost. They are not unavailable. They are managing the only way they know. This matters. It matters because if you have loved someone with avoidant attachment and experienced it as indifference, what you were experiencing was a suppressed signal, not an absent one. And if avoidant attachment is your own pattern, the productive anger here is yours. You were trained, specifically and repeatedly, to hide the very need you are now being asked to express. That training was not a character flaw. It was the price of staying close. The fourth attachment pattern was not part of Ainsworth's original classification. She had built her framework on 3 categories, but she knew something was incomplete. Some infants in the strange situation could not be placed. Their behavior was contradictory, disoriented, fragmented in ways that didn't resolve into any of the 3 organized patterns. They would approach the caregiver with their head turned away. They would reach up to be held, then freeze mid-movement. They would collapse into helpless stillness at moments of reunion. Mary Main, who who had been one of Ainsworth's graduate students and was now at Berkeley, spent years working to understand what she was seeing. In 1990, with her colleague Judith Solomon, she identified and formally described the fourth pattern: disorganized attachment. Here is the biological paradox at its center. It is one of the strangest things the science has ever found. The attachment behavioral system has one fundamental command. When you are frightened, go to the caregiver. Seek proximity. This is not a learned preference. It is an evolutionary imperative, so ancient and so deep that no reasoning process can override it. When the threat detection system activates, the attachment system activates simultaneously. The commands run in parallel. Scared? Go to the safe person. But what happens when the source of fear and the source of safety are the same person? When the caregiver is frightening, through abuse, through unpredictable rages, through their own unresolved terror that spills into their behavior, the child's nervous system faces an equation that has no solution. The threat activates the attachment system, which commands, go to the safe person. But the safe person is the threat. The system designed to organize behavior has nowhere coherent to go. Those infants still turn toward the caregiver who had frightened them. Every single time. Because biology had no other option. Take a breath. Let that sit. What disorganized attachment produces in adult relationships is a person who simultaneously needs intimacy and experiences it as danger. Who moves toward and then runs. Who finds themselves drawn to relationships that carry the original equation, where the person who feels most like home also feels most like threat, not because they are seeking pain, because their nervous system has never learned to fully separate love from the fear that arrived alongside it. This pattern is the one most strongly associated with relational difficulty in adult life. And understanding that is not an indictment of the person who carries it. It is a description of what the nervous system had to do when the environment gave it no other option. The question of what this means going forward, whether any of it can actually change, is exactly what the next finding addresses. And it is not the answer most people expect. In 1985, Mary Main, now at the University of California, Berkeley, published the framework for what she called the adult attachment interview. She had a specific question. Infant attachment, patterns correlated with caregiver behavior. But what was it, precisely, about a parent's own history that shaped how they showed up for their child? Was it the content of what had happened to them? The severity? The warmth or coldness of their own early years? She developed an interview. She asked parents to describe their earliest relationships with their own caregivers, to provide specific memories that illustrated their general descriptions, to reflect on how those experiences had shaped them as adults. She wasn't primarily analyzing what they said. She was analyzing how they said it. Because the finding that reframes everything that has come before it in this conversation, was not about the quality of the childhood. It was about the coherence of the story. Parents who could narrate their past with consistency and emotional honesty, who could hold both the difficult and the good without collapsing into either, whose words matched their memories, whose evaluation of their experiences made internal sense. Those parents had securely attached infants, regardless of what had actually happened to them in childhood. Parents who had objectively stable childhoods, but described them in fragments, in blandly idealized terms that didn't match the few specific memories they offered, who insisted everything had been fine, with no texture or detail to support it. Those parents tended to have avoidantly attached infants. Parents who became flooded when they tried to talk about the past, who couldn't find the thread of the narrative, who cycled through unresolved anger, whose emotion overwhelmed the story rather than living inside it. Those parents tended to have anxiously attached infants. And parents whose narratives showed a specific kind of collapse when speaking about loss or fear, brief disruptions in logic and language, as if something unprocessed was surfacing, were more likely to have disorganized infants, the et. Childhood trauma was not the decisive variable. The relationship to the story was, which means everything you've just heard looks different now. The infant patterns, the working models, the hyper-activating and deactivating strategies, the impossible equation of disorganized love, all of it is pointing toward the same place. The path forward is not to undo what happened. It is to be able to tell it. To hold it with enough coherence that it stops running invisibly in the background and becomes something you can look at clearly. The cost of an insecure attachment pattern in adult relationships is not simply that love is harder. It is that the pattern creates evidence for itself. If you are anxiously attached, you are not imagining that partners sometimes pull away when you express intense need. They often do. And when they do, your system registers it as confirmation. Proof that the original fear was accurate. That you really are too much. That connection really is as subtile, precarious as it has always felt. The strategy meant to secure the bond loosens it. And the loosening feeds the fear that powered the strategy. If you are avoidantly attached, you are not imagining that emotional containment tends to keep people in your life longer, at the surface level, than vulnerability does. In many contexts, it works. And when it works, your system registers it as confirmation that reaching is risky, that self-reliance is protection, that the lesson your early environment taught you is still correct. What it produces is the intimate distance you have always known. Close enough to need, far enough to not risk the particular loss that would confirm everything. And if you hold disorganized attachment, you may find that the relationships that feel most significant, the ones that register as real, as important, as alive, are often the ones that carry both pull and threat. Not because you are choosing suffering, because your system was calibrated to the specific combination of love and fear, and has not yet learned they can come separately. Here is what this means for you directly. If you have ever been told, by a therapist, by a partner, by yourself at 2 a.m., that you are too attached, or not attached enough, or damaged in some fundamental way your relationships keep confirming. Those words were naming the surface. The behavior that looks like clinginess or coldness or chaos is a survival strategy that is still running on information from a different time. It made complete sense then. The question is not whether it made sense then. The question is whether it is solving the problem you actually have now. In the same longitudinal study that produced the adult attachment interview, Mary Maine's Berkeley research documented something that the field still returns to. Some adults in the study had genuinely difficult or traumatic childhoods, and yet their AAI narratives were classified as secure. Not because they had sanitized their histories, not because they had decided to feel differently about what had happened, but because they had developed the capacity to hold it, to tell the story with honesty and coherence, to acknowledge the pain without being swallowed by it, to name what was good without pretending the hard didn't exist. Maine called this earned security. These individuals had done something, often through a relationship with a trusted adult, through years of therapy, through a long and non-linear process of making meaning out of what had happened, that allowed them to carry their history without being controlled by it. Their children were securely attached at the same rate as children whose parents had always been secure. The wound was not transmitted, because the story had been told. Researchers studying therapeutic change in attachment have documented that secure attachment can be developed across adulthood through what are called corrective relational experiences, relationships that are reliably responsive in ways that gently, repeatedly contradict what the working model predicts. The nervous system learns not through argument, not through insight alone, through accumulated experience that the world sometimes responds differently than it was trained to expect. This does not mean the change is simple or fast. The strategies carved by early experience run below the level of conscious intention. You cannot decide to stop hyperactivating, or deactivating any more than you can decide to stop flinching. The physiology is real, but you can develop what researchers call reflective functioning. The capacity to observe your own internal states and recognize that your automatic response to a situation is a response from the past, not an accurate reading of what is in front of you now. That the checking, and the dread, and the distance, those are memories in the body, not truth. And memory, unlike the past itself, can be revisited, examined, narrated, held with the kind of coherence that, according to the data, changes what you pass on. You are checking your phone. The screen lights. Nothing. You set it face down, then pick it up again. You know the pattern. You have named it. You know that the waiting is not really about tonight. It is about every night you waited for a different person, for the footsteps in the hallway, for the mood to shift, for the love to return to the room, for the face that made the world make sense to come back around. But something is different now. You put the phone down, not because the fear is gone. The fear is still there. The same ancient alarm, the same elevated cortisol, the same nervous system that has been running this program since before you had language. You put the phone down because you know what the waiting is actually about. And knowing does not cure the waiting, but it creates enough space between the alarm and the response that a choice exists where there wasn't one before. You did not choose the template. No one does. It was handed to you before you were old enough to ask why, in moments so small they left no conscious memory, only the shape of how you reach. But you are holding it now. And the care and honesty you bring to that story, the willingness to tell it clearly without collapse or erasure, is not just a therapeutic exercise. It is, according to the data, the most powerful thing you can do. If what you heard tonight named something you've been carrying without a name, please take a moment to share it. Or find the subscribe button so we can go deeper together next time. The sounds around you are settling. Let the breath move slowly. Let the body follow. You already know how to reach. Now you're learning that sometimes it's safe to rest.